As someone who defends people accused of crime, I'm a criminal defense attorney. I'm really, or as I often say, misunderstood by the government. I'm really excited to introduce our next panel, the state of criminal justice in Wisconsin and beyond. Full bios of our program participants are in your program. Jarrett Adams is a lawyer and post-conviction litigation fellow at the Innocence Project. After serving 10 years at a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, Jarrett was exonerated and went on to graduate from Loyola University Law School in 2015. Jarrett is three people over to my right. I also had the, thank you, Jarrett.
I learned that in England.
I also had the moving experience, along with my wife, Yvonne, and my law partner, Rebecca, and a few others, of hearing Jarrett's story yesterday evening after the criminal defenders dinner, and it was all at once poignant, tragic, and uplifting. Jerry Buting, all the way on the to my right, is a partner at Buting, Williams, and Stiling in Wisconsin. Jerry's present private practice is entirely criminal defense, both trials and appeals. He has defended the accused in many serious high-profile trial cases, including the Stephen Avery case, as shown in the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer. His first book, Illusion of Justice, Inside Making a Murderer and America's Broken System, was published by Harper in 2017. Jerry's a phenomenal lawyer with a great reputation in our state. Kim Fox is running a little late, but Kimberly M. Fox is the state's attorney of Cook County, Illinois. She took office on December 2016 and is the first African-American woman to lead the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, and will be here shortly. Matthew J. Pierce is a shareholder at Hughes, Sokol & Dunn. Pierce. Sorry, Matt, I messed that one up. In Chicago, Illinois, and is on the ACS Chicago Lawyer Chapter Board of Advisors. Matt is currently co-lead counsel in a class action lawsuit challenging money bail practices in Cook County. Our moderator is Valerie Newman, an assistant defender in the Michigan Appellate Defender Office. Val has practiced with the Michigan Appellate Defender Office for over 23 years, has argued hundreds of cases before Michigan and federal courts, and twice before the U.S. Supreme Court. I asked her last night at dinner, and her batting average at the U.S. Supreme Court is 500. Clearly a very phenomenal batting average. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's after lunch, and we're going to do our best to keep the energy up and enthusiasm high. So don't look at your phones, look at us. And we've worked long and hard to prepare for this panel. So it's going to be a good one. My name, as Craig said, is Valerie Newman. I'm an assistant defender at the Michigan Appellate Defender's Office. Obviously, I'm the moderator for today's panel. One quick housekeeping. If you're seeking CLE credit, please make sure you've scanned your name tag and signed the appropriate sign-in sheet. Turning to the panel, I'm going to ask each of them to speak for a few minutes, describing their experience with the criminal justice system. I will then lead the panel through a conversation around the current state of the criminal justice system and reform efforts, and then we're going to open the floor to questions. I'm going to deviate a little bit because I'm already up here and no one can tell me any differently. So if you have questions, we really would like to respond to any specific questions. I've asked all the panelists in talking about their experience and what they're doing and the questions that I'll put forth to try and make sure that they include something about what you can do if this is not going on in your state. Like if you want to know how to do these reform efforts or whatever, so maybe like a little action plan. I know ACS likes that, right? Get us motivated. So hopefully this panel will motivate you to go back to your home states and have some ideas about reforms you can, if they're not already taking place, that you can spearhead in your home states. So, without further ado, I'll start with Matt, you're closest to me. I can start with you.
Is this on? Now it's on.
There you go.
My experience in the criminal justice system. I graduated law school in the early 1970s. For most of the rest of that decade, after a brief stint in legal aid, I was in a small litigation practice that did a fairly significant amount of both criminal defense work and police misconduct litigation. Thereafter, I went to work on a large class action lawsuit involving political spying by the Chicago Police Red Squad and military intelligence and the FBI, which was broadly speaking criminal justice related, although I have to say that having reviewed those files, they had very little to do with criminal law enforcement. And then thereafter, after a few years of doing other federal litigation, I became the head of litigation for the city of Chicago under Mayor Harold Washington, in which capacity my biggest client was the Chicago Police Department, biggest client in the sense that it was the branch of city government that got sued the most often. So at some broad level, did police defense work, although a lot of other work for the city, both offensive and defensive. When I left the city in the late 1980s, after Mayor Washington passed away, I came to my current law firm. And at this firm, I've had a mixed litigation practice. I've done some police misconduct work and some other law enforcement related work, but the variety of my work greatly increased. But for the last several years, I have been involved in litigation in Cook County, which very much deals with the criminal justice system. I am co-counsel in a lawsuit challenging the practice of setting bail in amounts that defendants cannot meet or post, which practice we believe is unconstitutional. And related to that litigation, I've been involved in a number of outside of the courtroom advocacy efforts with local elected officials, changing that practice by way of rulemaking, both at the circuit court level and at the Illinois Supreme Court level.
Yeah, I don't mind at all. I'm next. All right. So, yeah, it would take forever for me to really tell my entire story. So, I'll use a story that is very near and dear to me, and that I haven't had the opportunity to share really with the person being here at all. So this is the first opportunity for me to do it. I was 17 years old. I was wrongfully convicted of a sexual assault. It simply was not true, but my case, not indifferent than a lot of other people who come from impoverished areas, I couldn't afford an attorney. I'd never been arrested before, and we were ill prepared to deal with the criminal justice system. I ended up being sentenced to serve 28 years here in Wisconsin, in the state of Wisconsin. I spent most of my prison time in Green Bay and in Walpond Correctional Facility. I needed help. I didn't have an attorney at the time that I exhausted my state public defender attorney. You know, at a certain point when you're appealing, it ends and you're pretty much on your own. I picked up a newspaper in the law library one day, and I started to find and locate different attorneys who were in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, period. And I came across an attorney, and I was able to get in touch with him. We communicated with each other, and I couldn't afford to retain him. But what he did agree to do was look at my habeas petition, and we edited through the mail for probably about 6 to 8 months. And it was that draft, which was shoddy in my opinion, because I was writing it with no legal education at all, that got the Wisconsin Innocence Project attention. And they came and they took my case. My case wasn't a DNA case. So it wasn't the I wasn't there, I didn't do it. It wasn't that type of case. So I needed to convince them why they should take my case and allocate their resources to a case that doesn't fit within their narrowly confined mission. So that attorney that helped me do that is in this room today. And that attorney is Rob. If you don't mind standing so I can embarrass you a little bit, Rob. So I've never got the opportunity to really tell that story while he was in the room or anything like that. But to answer the question that you started off with, if there's something that we can think of that we can do and tell other people to do, everybody can do what Rob did. You could take an hour out your day. You can take a moment, something that you're passionate about. There's always people who need help and who don't have the resources to do it themselves. I was released from prison after the Wisconsin Innocence Project obtained my reversal in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. The Seventh Circuit unanimously overturned my conviction. The prosecutor filed a motion, dismissed all the charges, and I came home in February of 2007. So you would think that this is just a moment where you know, I like to say, where the cameras are clicking and you see that photo shot of the person who's wrongfully convicted and they get out and you see their attorney and their arms are raised. That photo is so misleading. because what I had to deal with reintegrating back into society was extremely difficult. But I knew that if I was able to do it, then I can knock down a lot of the stigmas that come attached with people who go to prison, whether rightfully or wrongfully. And more importantly, I'm a bit of a mother's boy. My mother spent 10 years coming to see me from the state of Illinois, driving up. I remember one day she broke her leg, coming up, slipped in the parking lot on some ice to come and visit me 5.5 hours. So I told myself when I got out of prison, I said, look, if I don't do anything else, I'm gonna make sure I pay that woman back for supporting me all those years. Once I got, I got an understanding of how much I needed to really take therapy, to really just express and let out, the anger and frustration that was still within me. And it allowed me to channel this anger and frustration, and it became a fuel that has driven me to where I am today. I ended up graduating with my associate's degree, bachelor's degree, law degree from Loyola in Chicago, and I had the opportunity to do a dual fellowship on the same circuit that overturned my conviction in the Seventh Circuit with Judge Ann Claire Williams. I did 6 months in the Seventh Circuit, and I did another 6 months in the Southern District of New York with Judge Deborah Batts. Took and passed the New York bar. I was gonna do the Illinois bar, but after the New York bar, I didn't want a candy bar. So I was like, I'm done, man. I'm not doing any of this anymore. I'm pro-hocking in and all that good stuff. So, so after doing that, I got hired, as an attorney, a post-litigation fellow in the Innocence project with Barry Scheck, Peter Newfield. And it's kind of ironic, or if that's just a lack of a better word, my very first conviction that was overturned was right here in the state of Wisconsin. And I would like to tell you that I walked through the courtroom humble, but no, my arms were swinging like George Jefferson as I walked through there. Because the very first time they had to acknowledge me and look at me. And I can remember getting 28 years, and I remember the judge never even looking at me. And so for me to be addressed as Attorney Adams was something that was very magical for me. So thank you all, ACS, thank you for having me here. And that's my experience with the criminal justice system.
That's a tough act to follow, huh? My name's Jerry Buting. I started, I guess I've been in almost exclusively criminal defense practice for my entire career, 36 years. I started off as a public defender right here in Milwaukee, in the Milwaukee trial office for 9 years, and then went into private practice ever since. 98% of my career has been criminal defense, and the little bit that hasn't is constitutional rights, First Amendment rights, and civil rights, wrongful imprisonment type litigation. So, when I was asked to come to this panel, I thought, well, this is great. But then when I heard about the title of, the state of justice in Wisconsin, I'm thinking, boy, we're like coming to ground zero. I mean, 9/11 ground zero here, because there's just a big hole in the ground in the state of Wisconsin, and we need to build that Freedom Tower back up to take its place. Because in so many ways, we were really ahead of the game of the shift that we now see in Washington of regressive policies, regressive practices in our criminal justice system, in our correction system. But there are efforts to reform here in the state of Wisconsin. And more importantly, there are a lot of successful efforts elsewhere in the state. And those are some of the things I think we're going to talk about. And I'm really anxious to get some feedback from other people. The one thing that I think has been most amazing is my experience with Making a Murderer allowed me to go all over the world. I've talked to thousands, tens of thousands of people now in the last couple of years. And it's amazing no matter where you go, whether it's the Deep South, whether it's Europe or wherever, people have this thirst for justice. And I really liked Justice, if you were here this morning, Justice Tice's comments about Alexander Hamilton's observations in the Federalist Papers about how the judiciary's power really does come from its integrity. And I think that that's been under attack for a long time. It's been hastened in the last 8 months even. But I think that we can all come together and start to take back some of that, the common ground that we need to try and regain integrity, not just with our judges, but also with our lawyers on both sides, so that we can, I guess, remove the stigma that the legal profession has had placed on it from Hollywood for several decades now, from Better Call Saul to other types of portrayals of lawyers as being these sort of corrupt, sleazy advocates for injustice, when we're really not. So I'm really glad to see this organization come here to Milwaukee, where I think it is ground zero, and we need your support, but we're willing to support each of you in whatever state you come from as well.
Excellent. And Kim, we did introduce you in absentia.
Hey guys.
So last but not least, the question on the table sort of is a little bit of personal history of, what brought you into law, what you've been doing, and then any comments you want to add, and then I'll start asking questions.
Great. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me as part of such an esteemed panel. It's good to, I know mostly everybody. Nice to meet you. What brought me into law, very briefly, I come from the city of Chicago. I grew up in public housing in Chicago. I've been very vocal about my history in the city because it really shaped kind of the foundation of why I wanted to be an attorney, and quite frankly, the vision that I saw for the role that I hold as the Cook County State's Attorney. I am a child of a single teenage mother who was a high school dropout. I myself was a victim of sexual abuse and assault. And all of those things, those factors that I just enumerate wherever I go, is pretty much the profile of women and girls who are in our criminal justice system, both as victims and as defendants. And it's important that I give voice to that in my own experiences, and why I felt that it was necessary to have that perspective in our justice system, and particularly in the prosecutor's office. I am the first African-American woman to hold this position in Cook County, the second woman to hold this position, and I think the only person who's ever had the position from the projects. And that's important, I think far more important really than my gender and my race, in that we deal in our criminal justice system with a population of folks who live in conditions in which the people who make policy and execute policy know very little about. As I tell people all the time, if you watch The Wire, you may have yes, I know what it's all about. And while it is a very good show, it does not in any way talk about or deal with the real complexities of what happens in communities that are impacted by crime and violence, and even how those communities view the systems that are supposed to be there to protect them. And there's this notion, particularly in prosecution, of wearing the white hat and coming in and fixing community and fixing what's wrong. And absent from offices that do this work are people who really have an understanding of those communities and recognize that the strength and the solution to what's happening in those communities is actually in the community. And so I started my career as an assistant public guardian. Actually, I did workers' comp insurance defense work for 9 months. I feel compelled. I feel compelled to bear that part of my soul. But after that, I cleansed it working for the Cook County Public Guardian's Office, representing children who are in our foster care system. Again, children who have been alleged to have been abused or neglected or dependent, whose parents had mental health or drug addiction issues. My mother was bipolar. My mother self-medicated with marijuana and other drugs most of my life. And so these were children who were very similar to me. I went from there to the state's attorney's office, still in juvenile, and was intrigued by the fact that in the same building, on the same floor, in the same prosecutor's office, we treated children who were subjects to child protection petitions dramatically different the moment that they acted out of line, the moment that they tagged a building, threw a rock, knocked a kid down, and they went from being a victim to a defendant. And all of the things that we knew about them and the history that they brought with them went out of the window in our efforts to correct behaviors. And so I stayed in the state's attorney's office in juvenile for a bulk of my career because I wholeheartedly believed that it was there that we can have the biggest prevention or intervention investment that would have a long-term impact on our adult criminal justice system. Most of the young people who come through our juvenile delinquency division, the majority of them will end up in our adult criminal justice system. So I did that. I was an assistant state's attorney for 12 years. I left back in 2013 to go work for the Cook County Board President as her first deputy chief of staff for policy, looking at how we were spending our county dollars on criminal justice. We have the largest single-site jail in the country at 26 in California. We have the largest unified court system in the world. We spend upwards of $750 million on our criminal justice system, and asking what could we do better, and bringing a prosecutor's perspective to the conversation. And so we worked on everything, as Matt said, from bail reform and alternatives to detention to juvenile justice reform. Very proud of the work that we did around raising the age for automatic transfer legislation, reducing the juvenile detention population. And then the issue as it related to bail, and the move away from cash bail and the move to look at pretrial detention was stagnating, quite frankly, while working for the president's office. And largely because if this is an endeavor that you're going to do, you have to have buy-in from all of the stakeholders. And the biggest impediment to that buy-in was our then state's attorney. And I felt that if we were going to have real reform in Cook County, that it wasn't just going to be these one-off successes by different folks in the system, that you needed a prosecutor who was willing not only to participate, but to take a leadership role in that. And so I decided to run for state's attorney to do that, to work on disparities in race in our justice system. Cook County is 86% of our people in our jail are Black and Latino, 86%. Our juvenile detention center is about 94%. We just released actually our first data report from a prosecutor's office a couple days ago, again, showing the role that the state's attorney's office has in those racial disparities. And I ran at a time, again, on these reform issues where people weren't necessarily paying attention. And then we had a very high-profile police-involved shooting with the death of Laquan McDonald, which today is the 3rd-year anniversary of that killing. And it got a lot of attention and people talking about this race because of my predecessor and real activism around my election. And so we were able to talk about things and issues in prosecutors' races that you probably would not have been able to do even a year before that. What makes me most proud of that work and why I'm here today talking about the role of reform more broadly is when running that race and talking about, bail reform, ending mass incarceration, decreasing jail populations, all of that in Chicago with rising violence was a different campaign than how people run for prosecutors' offices. They typically bang their fist on tables and talk about being tough on crime, and my campaign was more like, what have we done here? And the good news, if I'm supposed to offer some measure of optimism, is that I look at prosecutors' races throughout the country right now, and I see, for example, in Brooklyn, the debate that was had around their election there with Eric Gonzalez. I see Aramis Ayala as the first African-American woman, or African-American period, in the state of Florida running on or having a platform against the death penalty. I look at Philadelphia with Larry Krasner, having not been in the prosecutor's office, but running on a civil rights platform, that it has ripple effects when you're able to, in large jurisdictions, do things that had traditionally not been done to move the needle on criminal justice reform. And so my mandate is to ensure public safety and at the same time make sure that we bring credibility to our system. So that's meant investments in our conviction integrity unit. It's meant investments in community outreach and engagement, and it's meant being fully present in conversations around bail reform and juvenile justice reform.
Great, excellent. Well, you hit on just about every single topic that we want to talk about. So that makes my job very easy as a moderator. So I'm going to start off. I know Matt mentioned the bail reform suit with a general question to the panelists, and probably ask Matt to answer first. With our current president and attorney general advocating for return to regressive and harmful criminal justice policies, it seems like we're not going to get a lot of reform on a national level. So what are some areas where state and local governments can prevent this backward movement and implement reform?
I think probably you've understated the problem at a national level. I think it's much worse than there not going to be a lot of reform. I think there's going to be a lot of retrogression, and there already has been a lot of retrogression, and I think that that is going to continue. If you missed the first part, I said that things are even worse with the Trump administration than the introduction indicated. Worse than that, I think that we, should prepare ourselves not only for 3 more years of this, but possibly for 7 more years of this. So I really think that this is a crisis. Before this disastrous election already, many people around the country were waking up to the realization that there is a tremendous amount of good work that can be done with state and local officials under the right circumstances. That is now, I hope, painfully obvious to everybody in this room and most ACS members and other open-minded progressives around the country. Whereas once upon a time, our orientation, of course, was towards the federal government with regard to civil rights issues, civil liberties issues, criminal justice reform issues, and so forth. These are all tactical decisions. I mean, there's nothing inherently superior about the quality of decisional process in the federal government than there is to state and local governments. It has been historically, in recent history, the case that we have had more friends there and more ability to move the ball forward. That is not true now, and therefore I think it is terribly important, as Attorney General Madigan said at lunch, for us to be developing relationships with local government officials. What can be done? We are really, I'm a sort of jaundiced critic of most elected officials, but I have to say this. We are blessed in Cook County right now. At every key position in the county, we have the best, most intelligent, most open-minded elected officials, at least in my lifetime. At the head of the list, the woman sitting to my far right on this panel. But at the county board level, our sheriff, an amazing place in Cook County to find somebody who has interest in criminal justice reform. Our sheriff has interest in it. The chief judge of what Kim correctly said is the largest consolidated court system in the world. The state's attorney, the public defender, and the attorney general. I mean, we really have a unique opportunity here. And as a result, there has been some terrific progress made. It's not easy, because these are complicated offices that these people hold. You heard Lisa Madigan say at lunch, she's both the defense lawyer for the government, and she engages in affirmative litigation on behalf of the people of the state of Illinois. Talk about a complicated job with conflicting obligations. I think Kim Foxx could probably give you all a doctorate in the complexity of being in a government position where it ain't easy to move the ball forward, but it can be moved forward. It requires, I think, fundamentally, and first it requires the right people in place. So you got to vote, and you got to back the right candidates, and you got to hope that your folks win. But secondly, it requires developing the relationships with the people in those offices. And thirdly, it requires pushing them. I've never been an elected official, never wanted to be, but I served in government for 5 years back in the 80s. And the mayor I worked for, who was just a terrific guy, Harold Washington, used to say, all politicians are exactly as good as people on the outside make them be, and that includes me. Politicians, by the very nature of their jobs, and I mean anybody who runs for elected office, not just career politicians, respond to pressures. They must respond to pressures. That is inherent in our democratic system. So we got to get them elected. We got to have conversations with them. And we got to continue to push them from the outside in the right direction because it helps them do their jobs better. Push them when you get your friends in there in a respectful way, but in a firm way. You know, we are litigating along with public interest organizations now in Cook County, in the Circuit Court of Cook County, to establish the critically important principle that nobody should have bail set in any criminal case, regardless of charge. Where bail is set, it should always be affordable. Otherwise, it's a cruel hoax on our justice system. To set bail in an amount that somebody cannot post is, of course, the equivalent of giving no bail. Bail is a constitutional right, both a state and federal constitutional right. And I'm very happy to say that State's Attorney Fox, County Board President Preckwinkle, Public Defender Amy Campanelli, Chief Judge Tim Evans, Sheriff Tom Dart have all joined in a request which was issued just a couple of weeks ago to the Illinois Supreme Court, asking the Illinois Supreme Court to issue by rule the very relief that we're seeking in litigation, which is a rule in the state that would require that there must be a hearing and findings of ability to pay as a precondition of the setting of cash bail anywhere in the state of Illinois. I don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do. I hope they will do the right thing and pass such a rule. Such a rule could have dramatic impact on the rights of persons throughout the state of Illinois and be a role model for the kind of work that can be done around the country. So that's my perhaps long-winded answer. It's multifaceted. But currently, you know, in Cook County and to some extent in the state of Illinois, the ball is moving forward as a result of that kind of dynamic and of having the right kind of people in those critical government positions.
Great. Thanks, Matt.
Can I add, you know, when Trump was elected president, everybody was concerned about criminal justice and all kinds of other issues, but you know, I tried to hope for the best because he hadn't really taken positions in the campaign and in the primaries. Actually talked like all of the Republican candidates about criminal justice reform as a bipartisan effort. When I saw him appoint Sessions as Attorney General, I started to get very concerned, and it's actually gotten worse than I even thought. But the good thing is that we have to keep in mind 92% or 95% of criminal justice happens at the state level, not the federal level. Yes, the presidency and the attorney general can drive policy as a big bully pulpit, but there were efforts already underway for criminal justice reform in the states before this happened. Most of them, I think, are still progressing, and there's been some successes where you would not expect it, because really, I think criminal justice reform is a bipartisan effort, whether it's because conservatives think we're spending too much money, too much taxpayers' money, and we're wasting it with mass incarceration, and we got to be smarter on that, which is what Texas started about 5 years ago, reducing their incarceration, or whether it's because people are just upset at the unfairness of the system and the racial bias that's in the system. We can find common ground. Criminal justice is one of those strange areas where there are strange bedfellows. Justice Scalia, who is not very good in many other areas of civil rights and justice, but on criminal defense matters and criminal justice matters was actually a big champion. You talk to criminal defense lawyers, he was probably the strongest justice in my lifetime when it comes to reinvigorating the Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses, the Sixth Amendment right to counsel, and it's because a lot of the far right and conservatives go back to the roots of our country and our Constitution and really distrust government power against the individual, as did our founding fathers. So you know, in some ways, this is also an opportunity for criminal justice reform that we can take advantage of if we do form those relationships and those partnerships, and we're willing to do that with constituencies that are the base of political movements that are not usually our companions. If we can find common ground in areas, I think we can. Texas, of all places, in my opinion, is leading the country in forensic science reform. You know, they have the Texas Forensic Science Commission. Even when Justice Sessions, or Attorney General Sessions, please, no, sorry.
Man,
Even,
take them off on flood alert.
That'd be longer than 7 years, too.
yeah, really.
He
that
just
would be a
wanted to make
nightmare.
sure you're all awake and listening.
But even when Sessions disbanded the National Forensic Science Commission, Texas is continuing to lead the way in a lot of reforms in DNA and other voodoo sciences like bite mark and hair comparison. And so, you know, Austin's crime lab was shut down, and scandals. I mean, every week it seems like there's a new scandal in our crime labs, and largely because they are housed as, in my opinion anyway, adjuncts of law enforcement all too often. And even when they're not under the direct auspices of the police, they're very often acting as partners with them rather than trying to seek real science in the courtroom. They're becoming advocates, or have been advocates for the prosecution. And Massachusetts, you know, 28,000 convictions were reversed in the last few months because of corruption in their crime lab, primarily 2 analysts who were falsifying results. Austin, who, by the way, was being, they were under the Austin Police Department, and who was being audited yearly by ASCLD, the Association of Crime Laboratories and Directors. This accreditation that supposedly is trumpeted as the be-all and end-all of independence of crime labs. Austin discovered that for years they were not even applying science. They were using the wrong statistics. And in their DNA lab, of all places, the Texas Forensic Science Commission said, we need to retrain these people. And 5 analysts were required to go to this training. 3 of them flunked out, and they had been there for 10 years or more. So, you know, there are efforts being made at the state level. The FBI lab, just to talk on the national level for a second, to their credit, a couple of years ago, released a study where they went back and looked at their own analysts' testimony in 250 or 260 some cases, and found that 98%, I think it was, 25 out of 26, something like that, analysts had either falsely or misleadingly testified in cases of hair comparison analysis. And a number of those people had already been executed. And so, to their credit, now this was still under Obama's administration, but to their credit, they partnered with NACDL, National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and started opening up old cases and looking further to see whether there might be some effort to try and correct some of the mistakes of faulty science. That's kind of, it's still ongoing, but it's, you know, the jury's still out on the national level of whether that will work. Wisconsin had offered to try and do the same thing. Actually, the Attorney General sent a letter saying, and actually the FBI director, Comey, sent a letter to all the crime labs saying, you know, we are not the only ones who used this faulty science in our courtrooms. Many analysts in the state crimes labs are doing the same thing. Why don't you take a look at your cases, reopen them? Wisconsin's crime lab has refused to do that. A number of states have refused to do that. But I think we need to expose that and publicly, publicly expose when they refused to do that, and so anyway, I could go on and on and on, but there are efforts being made on the state and local levels. So I don't think we should despair too much about what we hear from Washington, what we see from Washington, when we know that 90% of criminal justice happens at the state levels.
So I'm going to turn to Kim. It seems like you took a big leap by running for office. And I want to talk about, and we've heard a lot today from Attorney General, from Lisa and other people about the importance of progressive people running for office and people developing and maintaining relationships with them. I don't mean this to be a loaded question. You're not allowed to answer yes to all of it.
Okay.
But everyone in this room is obviously reform-minded. They want to make a difference. They're working to make a difference every day. But in terms of maybe thinking about next steps, other things they might want to do or different ways they might be able to reform the system, I'm sure you have some thoughts about where could that best be done? I mean, you need reform-minded people everywhere, but prosecutors' offices, defender offices, advocacy organizations, private practice, sort of what's your thought on maybe where you can make the most impact?
Obviously, I'm going to say prosecutors' offices. And I say that because it's not the likely place to do it. I mean, my politics didn't change when I left the state's attorney's office as an assistant. Having worked on the ground there as a woman of color who came from communities like the ones we were serving, it was a very difficult place for me to work. I'm very honest, particularly with people of color who work in my office. And it makes people uncomfortable when I talk about it, but I think we have to have uncomfortable conversations a lot. In a criminal justice system that is largely made up of defendants and victims, in Chicago, at least, or Cook County, that are largely communities of color, when you work in an organization that, again, does not have proximity to those communities and are setting policies that are under the guise of color blindness, which have disproportionate impacts on those communities, working in an office like that is difficult. I know in our prep materials, Paul Howard was referenced in having said, Paul Butler, about not working in prosecutors' offices. And I had the pleasure of getting into a really healthy debate with Paul about it. And Paul worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. and talked, and we had a candid conversation, and I think in ways that we don't do in public, about what it means to be a person of color, to be a black person working in a prosecutor's office when most of the people, victims and defendants, are black. And how crushing sometimes that is on the people who do the work, and the notion of kind of corrupting who you are and the experience that you have with a system that really doesn't take that into account. And so, I mean, that's my long way of saying that it's not easy to be progressive-minded in institutions that have been historically conservative and have historically been exclusive and not inclusive to vast communities. And the notion that on the defense side, and I've said this repeatedly, that's where people go. People who want to fight the good fight and want to, fight the man, go on the defense side. The extreme power that prosecutors' offices have to allow that to go unchecked, to allow that area of the justice system where you don't even get before a judge if the prosecutor doesn't file the charges. I mean, the level of the prosecutorial discretion, and it's not just because I have the job that I say is the most powerful actor in our criminal justice system. It is. It's more powerful than judges because you don't get to a judge but for me saying, file those charges. You don't get to a defense attorney but for the prosecutor hitting you with charges. And in those areas where those decisions are being made, the use of discretion to say, no, I'm not going to charge these cases. One of the things we did was we raised the felony threshold for retail theft in Illinois, the first 4 days that I got there. In Illinois, the retail theft felony threshold is $300. Right, $300. And if we just did our data report, the number 2 felony case that we prosecute in Cook County is retail theft. It's guns, that's real, and then retail theft, because our threshold is so low. And then when you look at who are the people who are being arrested for retail theft, and you see a constellation of issues, we see issues around homelessness, addiction, mental health, and we ask ourselves, we have the power, I have the power to do this, but I also have the power to not do it. And if you don't have people in those positions who have the power to make those types of decisions, and I from law enforcement partners got the stuffing beat out of me. Like, why are you doing it? You're lawlessness and recklessness. And I'm like, oh my God, in Wisconsin, it's like $2,500. In the liberal bastion of Indiana, it's $750. Like, what are we doing? You know, one of the other things, we have limited resources. We don't have enough bodies to do the work that we have to do. So I said, we're not going to prosecute any more misdemeanor cases of people driving on suspended licenses because of their inability to have paid a ticket, which is like common sense, that we have lawyers playing glorified bill collectors in courtrooms. But that comes from a perspective of, what are we doing? These are crimes against poverty, and being unapologetic about saying and asking, is this what we should be doing? But if we didn't have those voices and those perspectives in the prosecutor's office, we would continually do the same things. There's legislation that just passed around asset forfeiture that we were a part of, working with the ACLU. Again, historical places where state's attorneys, prosecutors' offices don't get involved. And so I wholeheartedly believe that if, you know, for those in the legal career, that if you don't have that perspective in that front end, you will always be reacting to bad policy. You will always be reacting to, and you can push and drive and change. They can change the laws in Illinois, and I can still use my discretion to apply the law how I see fit. That's just the fact. The law in Illinois is that a felony is $300, and I say, push off, no. And that's the power. But if you are absent from the table, from the decision-making, you will always be responding. I wholeheartedly believe we need a strong defense bar. One of the things that I'm very proud of is my ability to work with our public defender on these issues, where it is an adversarial system, but we believe on, you know, basic fundamentals of truth and justice and what's fair and right and equitable. And I believe that bar has to be healthy and robust. And everyone believes that, but no one says, do we have a fair, healthy, robust prosecutor's bar? And if we turn people away from it, if people say that's just not where I want to be, we will never have a healthy and robust prosecutor's bar, because we will continue to have the same people with limited experience doing that work or limited perspective. And so I think you can have a real impact. And then really quickly, if you're outside of the law, when I look at the justice system as a whole, by the time someone has gotten to me, and this is from my experience as a public guardian, there are so many touches that we could have had that we haven't touched, right? And we wait for the justice system to fix at the end. So I tell people all the time, whether it's school boards, whether it's education, when I look at the kids in our justice system and I look at their educational opportunities or lack thereof, it is shameful, it is shameful, it is shameful. When I look at mental health issues, it is shameful. When I look at what's happening around addiction, and we care now about the opioid crisis, but we didn't care about the crack epidemic and what happened to the folks then. Like, there's spaces everywhere in the continuum. And so for those who care about those issues, I think we do need those perspectives there on local bodies, you know, aldermen or city council, mayors, governors. A lot of the devastation that we've seen in Illinois over the course of the last 2 years is because we've had a failed leadership in Springfield, where we couldn't pass a budget for 2.5 years. And funding was cut for the very services that are necessary to move us away from the violence that we're seeing. And so there is a space everywhere. I believe there's an all hands on deck approach to all of this. And so I feel like people should get in. You talk about not wanting to take another bar. I don't know if I ever want to run for election again. It is awful. It's awful. I'm not even going to play with you. Yep. And the outcomes, the perspectives and the move that you will be able to make makes it worth it. So I give you no delusions of grandeur that you'll go in and it's just like a TV show. No, it's the worst thing ever, besides taking the New York bar, apparently. But we absolutely need those perspectives in the room at every level of government. And if you are in law, I would, interested in criminal justice, I highly recommend prosecutors' offices.
Thank you. And Jarrett, I'm going to ask you if you have anything to add to that. I know you wrote a blog for ACS, Discretions Disgusting Results, and if you had anything you wanted to.
No, I mean, I agree with everything Kim is saying. Look, the prosecutor is the most powerful piece on the board. I mean, you decide what charges you bring or not to bring charges. And, you know, one can say, we often see how, because of your status or your wealth, you are more than likely not, you know, going to be charged in certain cases. And you know, just using, for example, what's recently in the news. Now, in New York, people are charged on the subway for groping, just bumping up against people. So for Harvey Weinstein not to be charged with anything is amazing to me. Okay, and this is the tough DA inside Vance that really, you know, is he really is aggressive. And so for me to see that, one can have to logically ask themselves, you know, this is because of how powerful Harvey Weinstein is. If this was Jared Adams, would he be charged with something? So I look at that and I say to myself, it reminds me of when I did a study abroad in London. I did a study abroad in London for about 30 days. I was going to school at night at Loyola, so I wanted to graduate in 3 years with everyone else. So I convinced my boss, Carol Brook, the executive director of the Federal Defender, to let me do these 30 days because that would catch me back up. So I was doing it solely for the purposes of trying to graduate, but I was pleasantly surprised at what I learned in the Old Bailey, which is their court system. Now, I'm not saying that we should adopt the entire doctrine that England has, but what I will say is this. They have barristers over there. So you come in and you don't know if you're defending the case or if you're prosecuting the case. Now, let me tell you what that does. That keeps the sympathy and empathy needed in the criminal justice system that we lack in America. If it's an adversarial system, I don't care what it is. It can be a spoon clapping contest. The other side is gonna wanna win. When people usually go from being prosecutors to judges, one of the first things they say is not, Kim, well, you know what? I did something with that bail. They say, I had a 99-something conviction rate. When's the last time you heard a prosecutor say, look, you know, I had a good conviction rate, but there was this one case that was bothering me, and we got it wrong. And I went back in, and we got it right. And that's why you should select me. You don't hear that. We've conditioned ourselves in society to sleep easily with things in terms of the criminal justice system because we've painted this narrative for years that if you have handcuffs on you, you did something wrong or they wouldn't have you, right? And the people who go in and out of prison, they shouldn't be Jared Adams. Like I should have a tattooed teardrop under my eye right now, right? You know, so it's these narratives that we continue to deal with. And I've always said that the reason we have these problems in the criminal justice system is because the people that it disproportionately affects, they weren't there at the table when it was created. And you want to talk about bond and bail? How many poor people do you think were there when they were talking about bond and bail? Not many, because I'm sure the poor person would have said, wait a minute, you're telling me I got to stay in jail and I'm not convicted because I can't afford to get out? So it's things like that there are certain things that we can do that can ease a lot of the problems that we have in the criminal justice system. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but what needs to stop happening is all of the red tape that you got to go through. You know, all of the backlash that you have to go through. You know, it's one of these things where we have to figure it out and realize that this isn't a criminal justice issue. This is a human rights issue. We are displacing people, disenfranchising people. You want to talk about this election? Well, I know about 2-point-something million people who didn't get an opportunity to vote because they were right in prison. And even some of the ones who are released, they lose their right to vote in certain states. So it's things like that that make no sense. So if you're found guilty of a crime, you might as well get on a boat to North Korea because like you can't vote. That's the fundamental right of being an American. So it's things like that. And reintegration is a big issue that I look to focus more on in my legal career because I know how difficult it was for me to reintegrate. But then I also remember in prison, I met a lot of people. Like I did a lot of people's legal work and just trying to really learn and grasp the law so I can articulate my case better to people who are looking for help. So I met a lot of people. And one of the scariest things was not an act of violence that I saw in prison. It was just listening to people as they were getting ready to be released in the wintertime. And by the end of the next summer, those same people were back. That was one of the scariest things I ever saw in my life. Because I'm looking at people, and honestly, I asked one guy, I'm like, you know, what's going on? What you doing back here, right? And so he just looked at me with a straight face, and he said, look, fool, you think I like selling drugs and getting shot at? There's nothing else in this community to do. So some people are born in situations where it's not their fault. Some people can make it through. Some people can be Kim Fox. Some people can be Jarrett Adams. But the likelihood of that, without us helping and getting down on the ground, is highly unlikely. And what we're doing is this. We're actually robbing ourselves of contributors to society based off nothing but how they look, who they are, and their resources. And I can't state that enough, that reentry is one of the most important things, especially in the city of Chicago. The people are being released, and they're being released by the thousands. Like, I think on a monthly basis, there was a number I saw on 1,000 monthly basis people are coming out. Well, they're not reintegrating back into the north side, right? They're going back on the south side, they're going back on the west side. And it's just mighty strange that the most impoverished areas have some of the most expensive guns lying in wait everywhere. And so this isn't an accident. At this point in time, we have enough anecdotal evidence to suggest and show that there should be a mental health care focus on people who go in and out of incarceration, more so on the back end when they're reintegrating back into society. We should have family support systems that help people, because the family didn't have a dog in this fight, but they make home to the people who go to prison. And think about the concept of prison. So we lock you up like an animal, fed like an animal, treated like an animal, and then we release you sometimes after decades, and we say, now you go be human. That absolutely makes no sense at all. So these are just my ideas of what can immediately ease and help our communities. And reentry is one of the biggest ones. You can't house people, warehouse them for years, not teach them any skills, and expect for them to get out and to do well, especially considering the fact of all of the things that come along with being a felon. Well, you can't get this job. We got to check this box. Well, you got to do this. Like, look, if you sell drugs, you can't even get certain financial aids. So it's like, come on, you think people are selling drugs because that's like the thing to do? Like, no, more than likely, they really don't have an education. So if you decide to turn your life around after selling drugs, you can't get certain financial aid. But if you shoot somebody, you can get financial aid. It's just nonsense. It really is.
All right, well, I am going to leave time for questions. So I'm sure that people have lots of questions. I already hand is raised, so go ahead.
Thank you. First, Jarrett, thank you for being here. You're right. The New York bar is the only one that means anything. I have a question, I think most of you for Ms. Fox. I'm a former prosecutor in upstate New York. And could you please speak to the role of the grand jury? This is something that not every state has a grand jury. New York does, Illinois does. And it's largely become just an appendage of the prosecutor's office. Do you think that it was meant to be that way? And do you think that there's any room for reform?
So you want me to do the ham sandwich analogy? I think the room gets it. I mean, we do have a grand jury system in Illinois. Do you have that one here in Wisconsin as well? Or? No.
We have it, but it's almost never used.
Yeah. And so we have it, and I was surprised by our use. We use the grand jury about 20% of the time. And usually we use it on the back end when we try to get a true bill. Once a case comes and is referred to our office, we have what we call our felony review unit who approves the charges. What we will then, rather than go to a preliminary hearing where we have to present is there probable cause, in certain cases, largely our homicide cases, we will go to the grand jury and get a true bill from the grand jury. We don't So we don't overly use it, but it is an appendage. I mean, it is. I've never seen a case in Cook County where the grand jury, where a prosecutor has went to get a true bill and didn't get one. I could be wrong. It is why when we looked in other jurisdictions, particularly as it related to officer-involved shootings, where attempts to abdicate one's responsibility for rejecting cases were sent to the grand jury. I think Eric Garner's case went to a grand jury and there was a no bill. I think Tamir Rice went to a grand jury and there was a no bill. And so I will tell you, as a longtime prosecutor, I was like, I've never heard of such a thing until we heard of it regularly when it was being used for the purposes of not getting a bill. So yes, I do think that it is not. If we're being honest, I do think it's an appendage of a prosecutor's office. We have the access to it. We can convene and go and do and present. It is us doing all the presenting. And generally it's done when we want a true bill, and I've never seen us not get a true bill.
Do you think that criminal justice reform has room for an independent grand jury?
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I had more thoughtful answer. Yes. That's Illinois bar.
There was a recent article, I think either in Mother Jones or The Nation, about how DA associations have been a significant obstacle to reforms, sometimes even going against, their members who are reform-minded. So I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts on how you can combat those groups. I mean, they're really well-funded, they're politically connected. And a lot of times they're led by people who come from the tough on crime era, who will continue to go against their own members who are more reform-minded. And they've been really successful in blocking reform. So I'm curious to hear any thoughts on how that can be combated.
Just quickly so I can see the mic to others. Yes, it was The Nation, and it was the article about what was happening to Aramis Ayala out in Florida. And the Florida District Attorneys Association filed an amicus brief against her use of discretion in not applying the death penalty. Yeah, district attorneys associations have been historically very powerful. When you go down to your legislative capitals, and all of the tough on crime bills that you've seen, sentencing enhancement bills and the like, you usually will see the District Attorneys Association there pounding the table. What's been helpful for me in Illinois, Cook County, again, our office is second largest in the country, so obviously we're the biggest in Illinois. Our footprint is huge. So when I won election, there's like Chicago and then there's the rest of Illinois. And it was, here's this woman from Chicago. There are very few women prosecutors in Illinois. There are no people of color prosecutors, and they knew that I came in on a reform agenda. So what they did with me was, can you just tell us what you're gonna do before you do it? Because they knew the might that we had. If the biggest actor is not with the association, then it lessens their power. And so for the work that we did on asset forfeiture, we were able to say, stand down. We used our power to tell the State's Attorneys Association to stand down. And because, again, it was the weight of my office to be able to do that, there was other legislation on enhancements that we said we didn't want to do, things around sex offender registry that they were trying to push, and we said don't do it. And so it was a matter of using our weight, but that's Illinois, right? And that's the unique perspective of Chicago. On some of the national associations, the National District Attorneys Association being one, who seemed to have a cozier relationship with the Sessions DOJ than I would feel comfortable with, asked if I would join their membership. And I was able to say, I got issues with how you all looked at the forensic work. I don't know that I can lend my name to that. And they were like, oh, no, well, come to 2 meetings and we'll convince you otherwise. And so I think there's a recognition, particularly with large jurisdictions, of the power to change the dynamic in those associations. But if you look in Louisiana and the work around reform, the District Attorneys Association was like not having it. And so I do recognize that their power, but I do think geography also has a role to play in it. But even in liberal California, they'll tell you, that the DA's Association in California was fighting a lot of the work that was being done around Prop 47, Prop 57. So they are a force. but it's also why you need to elect more progressive prosecutors across the country.
All right, probably time for.
They did lose in California recently on that. They were very much opposed to a lot of the reforms in the recent reform bill, and actually when they convinced the governor to veto some of them, including the sort of the Brendan Dassey reform law on juvenile interrogation the year before, they failed when a lot of other advocates got together, juvenile justice advocates, and really put the pressure on the governor's office, and this time they lost. So they are powerful, but it is possible if you form the right partnerships to overcome some of that.
And I was going to say too, so I'm actually doing some research on the question that you asked, but I'm doing it on the back end to expose what I think are hidden figures that are behind this. And one of the biggest hidden figures is corporations, corrections corporations of America. So what they do, and what I found is the prison boom, and when they started, is a direct correlation of what we have right now with these bad laws and with this no criminal justice reform, get rid of this DNA analysis. The hair, oh my God, this hair stuff is horrible. But there's bite mark, that's horrible. There's people who get up and testify about arson and have made millions and millions of dollars, and they have been dead wrong. But there is a backing behind them because these prisons are lucrative businesses. You're talking about businesses inside of the business itself with, shower shoes, flip-flops, toothbrushes, canteen items. There are people who are making a whole lot of money off of that. One of the first things that happened when Jeff Sessions got appointed, he kept saying how violence was up and you need to be tough on crime. So what did he do? He removed the phone cap off of how much a person can be charged when they're calling their family. Because surely that would make us safe out here in the world, right? It just made no sense at all. So those are some of the things that I'm looking to start in a series of writing. So whoever's out here want to help me with this research. But I'm looking to try to expose some of the things that I think that we just need to shine a spotlight on people who are supporting powerful moves that are being made. This immigration stuff isn't about immigration. This is about filling up those private prisons that Obama was getting rid of. And when you have prisons that are open, and I hope my wife isn't watching, it's like space in my wife's closet. If it's room, she's gonna find something to hang in there. And that's exactly what this is. And this is a business. When people are deported, they aren't deported right away. When I was working with the Federal Defender Program in Chicago, when people were incarcerated and they were supposed to be deported, they would be in these outlying county jails and facilities for the longest time. And so what are these facilities doing? They're getting paid by the number of heads that they have in there. So this is a business, and we just need to ask the people who are supporting and throwing the money, why is it that they're doing it if this is about, criminal justice reform?
I give Matt the last word.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments off of what everybody else in the panel said. One is with regard to your original question, which is how do you deal with these DAs associations? I think Kim answered it, but only at the end of her talk, and that is more Kim Foxes. You need to elect more people as the district attorneys to change the political culture of those DAs associations. There's no answer short of that. They are reflective of the political views of their membership. And it also, there's been a number of references up here, to who we're looking for. I want to, I sound like maybe a cheerleader for the state's attorney of Cook County, but I want to emphasize something about how extraordinary this is, and I think it's a lesson to who you're looking for. She beat a woman of color. Okay, the incumbent state's attorney of Cook County was a woman of color, a long-term incumbent and one of the worst state's attorneys we've ever had. So the issue isn't racial or gender, right? The issue is whether you believe fundamentally in serving the broader community, rich and poor, black and white and Latino alike, not what family you were raised in or what the chromosome combination was that led to your birth. Additionally, back to my point about sort of keeping the pressure on, Barack and Michelle Obama were old friends of ours from Chicago, and they Barack did some good things as president. He did some shameful things as president. And he did them because the pressure was off. Because everybody sat back and said, oh my God, we got a progressive black guy for president. And so that takes care of that problem. Well, it didn't. Those private prisons were filled by the Obama immigration policies, filled to the max by the Obama immigration policies. And we let that happen, and we let them take a slide. It is true that late in the administration, they started finally phasing out those contracts that they had with the Corrections Corporations of America and whatever Wagon Hut became, I guess that's CCA. But this was the deportation president, all right? And he criminalized a huge part of the community. That's who's in those private prisons, is undocumented people, largely who are convicted of the crime of illegal reentry, crossing the border in an attempt to reunite with their family. So it's time to think outside the box. It's time to question our law enforcement policies in the criminal justice context and in the immigration context. And it is time to both elect people capable of doing that and then keeping them honest by demanding that they do that once elected. Sometimes you get lucky and you don't have to, but you should never sit back and allow that to happen because, again, government officials are as good as the people who elect them demand that they be.
All right, well, thank you, Matt, and thank you to the panel.